Brian buys a house. Rachel rents the exact same house down the street and invests every dollar she doesn't hand to a mortgage. They both walk away certain they made the smarter move. And they're both wrong, because one of them is pouring money into a house he doesn't really own yet, and the other just found a fortune she'll probably never let herself keep. When you run the real numbers over 20 years, the winner is not who you think, and the whole thing flips on one detail almost nobody bothers to check. My name is Nick. Let's keep this dead fair. Brian and Rachel are the same age, earn the same $90,000 a year, live in the same city, and each have $50,000 saved. Same everything. The only difference is what they do one ordinary Tuesday. Brian signs a mortgage, partly because his Uncle Dave has spent a decade insisting that renting is throwing money away. Rachel signs a lease. 20 years later, one of them is right, and the reason is going to sting. Let's start with Brian, because Brian is having the best week of his life. He buys a median American house, which right now runs about $415,000. He puts down 10%, $41,500, and borrows the rest at around 6.5% on a 30-year fixed. His monthly principal and interest come to roughly $2,360. At the closing table, he signs about 40 documents, hands over another $10,000 in closing costs he mostly forgot to budget for, and walks out holding a key. Brian owns something now. He can paint the walls any color he wants, and nobody on earth can tell him to stop. For about a week, he is the happiest man alive. Rachel rents the identical house down the street for $2,000 a month. No down payment, no closing costs, no key ceremony, no 40 documents, no housewarming. She takes the $41,500 that Brian used as a down payment, adds the $10,000 he burned on closing, and drops the whole $51,000 into a boring total market index fund. Then she sets up an automatic transfer for the gap between her rent and what Brian's house truly costs him every month, and she forgets about it. Nobody asks Rachel for a tour. She got a confirmation email. It did not come with a cheese plate, and nobody drove across town to stand in her kitchen holding a bottle of wine and silently judging her countertops. On day one, Brian has a house, a mailbox with his name on it, and a story to tell at dinner. Rachel has that email. It is not close in terms of how it feels, but feelings and math have never once been the same thing, and this is exactly where the gap between them starts opening in a direction nobody at the housewarming would predict. Here's the number everyone stares at. The mortgage payment, $2,360 a month. That's the figure Brian proudly holds up next to Rachel's $2,000 rent, and he smiles, because his payment buys equity and hers just evaporates. There's only one problem with that comparison. The mortgage payment is not what a house costs. The mortgage payment is the down payment on what a house costs. Property taxes, about 1% of the home's value every year, which on Brian's place is another $350 a month, and it climbs every time the county decides his house is worth more. Insurance, homeowners coverage runs him around $200 a month, and it has jumped almost 50% in 5 years because the weather stopped cooperating and the insurers noticed. Private mortgage insurance. Because Brian put down less than 20%, he pays a monthly penalty for the crime of not already being rich, about $150, until he slowly claws his way to 20% equity years down the road. And then maintenance, the quiet killer. The rule of thumb is 1 to 2% of the house every year, another $300 to $700 a month averaged out, except it never arrives as a tidy monthly bill. It arrives as a water heater that dies in February, and a roof that waits for the worst possible moment and then vanishes $8,000 in a single afternoon. Those big hits aren't bad luck. They're a schedule. Roofs last about 20 years, furnaces about 15, water heaters about 10, and each one is a guaranteed 4 and 5 figure bill with Brian's name already on it. The roof does not care what month it is. The roof has a calendar, and Brian was not invited to the meeting. Funny thing, Uncle Dave's big speech about building equity somehow never once mentioned the roof. Add all of it together, and Brian is not spending $2,300 a month on his house. He's spending closer to $3,400. Rachel's all-in cost is $2,015, renter's insurance included, because renter's insurance costs about the price of 2 coffees. So the real difference between them isn't a rounding error, it's roughly $1,400 a month, and every dollar of it is pouring into Rachel's index fund, while Brian is standing in his kitchen at 10 p.m. arguing with a plumber about a part. And before you assume Brian just picked the wrong house, here's a tool you can steal so you can check your own place in about 10 seconds. It's called the 5% rule. Take the price of the home, multiply by 5%, and divide by 12. On Brian's $415,000 house, that comes out to about $1,700 a month. That is the true unrecoverable cost of owning, the taxes, the upkeep, and the money your down payment could have been earning somewhere else, none of which you ever get back. If you can rent the same place for less than that number, renting wins on paper. If comparable rent costs more, buying pulls ahead. So run your own address through it right now before the video ends. Brian is paying $1,700 to own, and Rachel is paying $2,000 to rent, which makes this particular fight close to a coin flip, which is exactly why it deserves real math instead of a one-liner from your uncle. So fast forward 3 years and see who's ahead, because at year 3 it isn't subtle. Rachel's portfolio. The $51,000 she seeded plus $1,400 a month at a normal market return is sitting around $80,000. Brian has built something too, though a lot less than he thinks. He's chipped a sliver off his loan, and it truly is a sliver, because in the early years of a 30-year mortgage, almost none of your payment touches the loan itself. Here's the stat that belongs on every closing table and never is. Over the full 30 years, Brian will pay nearly the entire price of the house a second time, just in interest, and he won't put a single dollar more toward the home than toward the bank until somewhere around year 18. Right now, he isn't paying off a house, he's renting money, and the house is barely his. Still, between that thin slice of principal and a little appreciation, on paper he's got maybe $50,000 in equity. Sounds respectable until you remember the exit. If Brian sold at year 3, he'd hand a realtor 5 to 6% of the sale price on the way out, $20-something thousand plus his own closing costs. And no, that didn't really change after the big realtor lawsuit everyone swore would end commissions. They still get their cut. After the exit toll, Brian's first 3 years of ownership have netted him almost nothing. He didn't buy an asset, he rented one from a bank and paid extra for the privilege. Now, if I stopped right there, I'd be doing exactly what every Rent Forever guy on the internet does, showing you half the math and calling it a verdict. So let's be fair to Brian, because he is holding one enormous weapon Rachel does not have, and it is called leverage. Brian put down $41,000, but he controls a $415,000 asset. When that house rises 4% in a year, that's $16,000 of appreciation sitting on top of a $41,000 bet. That's the bank's money making Brian richer, and Rachel's sensible index fund is not leveraged 5-to-1. It is the one advantage stock investors can't easily copy, and it's the reason real estate has minted more everyday millionaires than the market has. Uncle Dave, for once, was standing next to something true. Brian's also got the tax code on his side, at least a little. He can write off his mortgage interest, and when he eventually sells, the first $250,000 of profit, or $500,000 if he's married, is completely tax-free, a break Rachel's brokerage account will never get. In fairness, that mortgage write-off is far smaller than the legend suggests. After the tax rules changed a few years back, only about 1 in 10 people even itemizes anymore, so most homeowners get nothing from the famous deduction their uncle keeps bragging about. But the tax-free profit when he sells the place he lived in, that one is very real, and it is very big. There's a second force working in Brian's favor, and it takes years to surface. His payment is frozen. That $2,300 mortgage costs the same in year 5 as it did on day 1. Rachel's rent, meanwhile, has been creeping up about 4% a year, the way rent always does, silently on the renewal letter she doesn't bother to read. Give it 5 years and Brian's house is worth more, his loan is smaller, his payment hasn't moved a dollar. And the $1,400 gap that was feeding Rachel's portfolio has started to shrink. The buyer is clawing his way back into this fight, and Rachel's path carries a cost of its own, one that never shows up in any tidy average. Her portfolio does not climb in a smooth, comforting line. Some years it falls off a cliff. In a bad crash, it can drop 30% in a matter of weeks, and watching $100,000 evaporate on a screen is exactly the sort of thing that makes ordinary people panic and sell at the worst possible moment, locking in the loss for good. Brian's house never flashes a red number at him over morning coffee. It just sits there, boring and solid and lived in, and that steadiness is worth something real, even if a spreadsheet refuses to price it. Somewhere around year 6 or 7, the thing nobody in this argument likes to admit finally happens. They tie. This is the break-even point, the exact moment the buyer's brutal early losses and the renter's early lead cancel each other out. Nationally, that crossover lands right around 6 years. Before it, renting wins almost every time. After it, the math starts tilting slowly and patiently toward the person with the fixed mortgage. Brian doesn't feel it happen, Rachel doesn't feel it either. But the curve has bent, and it's bending his way. By the 10-year mark, they're standing on roughly even ground. And this is where it gets interesting, because even is hiding two completely different lives. Brian got here by pouring hundreds of hours into one house. Lost weekends fighting the gutters, a kitchen remodel he's still paying off, a decade emotionally handcuffed to one asset in one zip code, praying the neighborhood doesn't turn. Rachel got to the same number by doing, mechanically, almost nothing. She never fixed a thing. She never lost a Saturday to a hardware store. She owns a slice of 500 companies instead of one aging roof, and she could turn the whole pile into cash by Friday. Same net worth, wildly different price of admission. Brian worked for his, Rachel waited for hers. And Rachel's freedom isn't only financial, it's literal. If a dream job opens up across the country, she gives 30 days notice, packs a truck, and she's gone. No realtor, no staging, no praying the market cooperates on her timeline. If Brian gets that same call, he has to sell an entire house first, eat that 5 to 6% exit toll all over again, and hope a buyer shows up before the opportunity does. Rachel bought optionality, Brian bought roots. Both are worth something, but only one of them lets you change your whole life on a Tuesday. Then, time does something to Brian it never does to Rachel. It makes him cheaper. That frozen mortgage that felt so heavy in year 1 feels lighter every year, because his income drifts up and his payment doesn't budge. Rachel's rent, meanwhile, has marched from $2,000 toward nearly $3,000, and it is never coming back down. Push this out far enough, and Brian's mortgage simply ends. It's gone. He lives in that house for the cost of property taxes and the occasional furnace, while Rachel is still writing a rent check the month she turns 80. That's the part the spreadsheet doesn't shout loudly enough, and it's the strongest card Brian holds. So, who wins at 20 years? If Brian's house appreciated at a healthy clip and Rachel got sloppy and spent her savings, Brian wins, and it isn't close. His house is worth well over $500,000, his mortgage is nearly dead, and his equity sits north of $500,000. But if Rachel truly invested that difference every month the way she swore she would, her portfolio lands in that same range, $500,000 to $600,000, except hers is liquid, diversified, and never once needed a new roof. Line up the final net worth, and they're in the same ballpark. How they got there is a different planet. And now for the detail I promised would flip the whole thing. It turns out to be two, and together they decide everything. The first is how fast houses actually go up, because everyone assumes real estate is an unstoppable rocket, and it is not. Strip out inflation and American home prices have risen about 1% a year over the long run. 1%. Over that same century, stocks returned about 7% a year after inflation. So every time somebody runs this comparison with a fat, optimistic appreciation number, they're pressing a thumb on the scale for Brian. Run it with the honest, historical 1% number, and Rachel doesn't just tie. She pulls ahead and keeps pulling. Brian bought a slow, heavy asset with high friction and a leaky roof and called it an investment. Rachel bought the entire economy and paid almost nothing to hold it. And there's a risk buried in Brian's win that nobody prints on the brochure. His whole net worth is one house on one street in one town chained to one local job market. If the big employer leaves or a storm parks itself over his particular roof, his one undiversified asset takes the full hit, and he can't exactly sell the spare bathroom to raise cash. Rachel's money is spread across 500 companies on several continents. One of them can burn to the ground on a Tuesday and she will never feel it. This right here is the thing the internet gets wrong about money, sometimes on purpose, because buy a house. It always goes up is a far better headline than it depends on about 9 different variables. If you want the version of this math that fits your city, your rent, and your real interest rate instead of a slogan printed on a thumbnail, that's the entire reason our school community exists. We run these numbers for real people in real markets, and the link is right below this video. The second variable quietly wins the whole argument, and it has nothing to do with houses. It's whether the renter actually invests. On paper, in a lot of markets, Rachel wins. In the real world, most renters are not Rachel. The median renter in this country has almost nothing invested, a few hundred to a couple $1,000s year after year. Because the $1,400 a month that was supposed to flow into index funds instead flowed into takeout, a nicer car, and a weekend that got a little out of hand. That is the buyer's real secret weapon, and it's almost embarrassing how simple it is. A mortgage is a savings plan you are not allowed to skip. It forces Brian to build wealth whether he feels like it that month or not, which is the real reason the typical homeowner is worth nearly 40 times the typical renter. Not because bricks are magic. Because most people, left alone, do not save, and the bank made Brian do it at gunpoint. So maybe Uncle Dave wasn't completely wrong after all, he just had the right answer for entirely the wrong reason. So let's be straight about both of them, because neither one is the fool the other thinks he is. Renting wins if you're disciplined enough to invest every dollar you save, if you're likely to move within a few years, or if you live somewhere prices are so insane next to rents that buying never catches up. Places like San Francisco where the math never crosses the line at all, not even at 30 years. Buying wins if you're going to stay put 7 years or more, if rents in your town run high against home prices, or, the big one, if you know deep down you are never going to invest the difference. If that money is going to get spent, buy the house. The house will save you from yourself. Because here's what Brian and Rachel both missed. One at the closing table and one at the lease signing. Neither of them ever ran their own real numbers. Their city, their rent, their rate, their honest odds of staying put, their honest odds of staying disciplined. Brian bought because Uncle Dave said renting is throwing money away. Rachel rented because a video told her homeowners are suckers. And 20 years on, look at what each of them actually held. A key that cost Brian $8,000 every few years and finally turned free the month the mortgage died, and a confirmation email that just sat there, compounding the entire time. Both of those worked. Neither of those was luck. The real trap was never renting, and it was never buying. The real trap is picking one off a slogan and never doing the arithmetic for your own life, which, if you take one thing from all of this, is the whole job and the whole reason I keep running these numbers with the people who bother to show up for it. I promised you a winner at the start of this video. The honest answer is that there isn't one, and that is the entire point. And if you're wondering what happens when you do both, own the home and invest aggressively at the same time, well, that's a completely different video, and the math might surprise you all over again. But for now, the next time someone tells you renting is throwing money away, or that buying is always the smart move, ask them one quiet question. Did you include everything? Because the only answer worth trusting is the one that did.